The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Pastoral Care for LGBTQ Victim Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence. I'll introduce our presenters in just a moment, but first we're going to go over a few technical details. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please check to make sure that your speakers or headphone are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, I recommend that you exit the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then try to reconnect again. All audience members are muted throughout the presentation. If you have questions or comments, you can submit them to me using the question feature on the right side of your screen. We'd love to hear from you. You can submit your questions anytime during the presentation, and I'll hold on to them until the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We hope to have about 15 minutes to answer as many questions as possible. If for some reason you don't see the question box on your screen, there's a small orange arrow. If you click on that, that will expand your feature options and you should be able to see the question box. The slides that you see on the screen today will be sent to you as a PDF later this afternoon, so you'll have them as a resource. And lastly, we're recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who can't attend the live presentation, so we welcome those who are listening in the future. We want to thank the In Faith Community Foundation for their sponsorship of today's webinar. This is one of a series of 12 that In Faith Community Foundation has sponsored this year. They are a national charity with a mission to serve donors, spread joy, and change lives. This is part of their Ending Family Violence initiative. Over the last few years, they've sponsored dozens of webinars, and you can find recordings of many of those on our website. Please visit infaithfound.org for more information about their great work, and we thank them for their sponsorship and their partnership. We have three presenters today: Dr. Jeanne Hoeft, Reverend Dr. Jeanne Hoeft, sorry I didn't fix that, Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune, and Reverend Dr. Joretta Marshall. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to do a very brief introduction. Reverend Dr. Jeanne Hoeft is Associate Professor of Pastoral Theology and Pastoral Care, and Franklin and Louise Cole Associate Professor of Town and Country Ministries at St. Paul School of Theology. She's an ordained elder at the United Methodist Church and has served as a pastor of local churches in Colorado and Florida. She's worked for the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence for several years, and she's written numerous articles and a book on intimate partner violence, including a forthcoming article entitled Queering Intimate Partner Violence. We're delighted she's joining us today. Reverend Dr. Joretta Marshall is Executive Vice President and Dean at Bright Divinity School, where she is also Professor of Pastoral Theology and Care. She's the author of numerous books and articles on pastoral care, including Counseling Lesbian Partners and Forgiveness and Abuse, Jewish and Christian Reflections. She's ordained as an elder in the United Methodist Church. And lastly, we have Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune. She is the founder and senior analyst at Faith Trust Institute. She's been central to the ongoing movement with both faith communities and secular advocates in addressing domestic and sexual violence and abuse. Her books are widely read and considered foundational references in the field. So, audience members, just a reminder, you can send us your questions anytime. And Marie, I'm going to hand it over to you. Are you there?
I'm here. Thank you, Sarah. And welcome to everyone who's on the webinar. We're glad to have you, and we really do welcome your comments and questions at any point. We're going to start with the poll that we often do. Partly it helps us to know who you are and helps you to know who you are. So if you just take a minute and select a category that might fit for you, and then we'll see the results of that, so we have a sense of the audience today. This webinar is the third in a series of 3 where we have been addressing the needs of LGBTQ survivors and abusers of intimate partner violence. And the other 2 previous webinars are available as recordings on our website, and we would, if you missed those, we would certainly invite you to go back and pick those up. We'll send you the links to access those, and you can listen to them in your own time. Do we have a response? Oh, good. Okay. So here's who we are. 30% clergy, 20% lay leaders, 40% advocates, and 10% others. So very good. That's a diverse group. And so we're looking forward to your concerns and questions as we dialogue around this important issue. So thank you for doing that. We're not going to review all of the information from the previous sessions, but we do want to just be clear about the kind of general definition that we're working with in today's discussion. Violence in intimate relationships has many names at this point in time: domestic violence, intimate partner violence, dating violence, partner abuse. Is specifically the pattern of behavior where one intimate partner coerces, dominates, or isolates another intimate partner to maintain power and control in the relationship. And so that's our basic framework for understanding these issues, and today we're looking specifically about this manifestation of intimate partner violence in LGBTQ relationships. So in the next slide, just again to review that particularly in this conversation, it's important to keep in mind the context, the social context that people are living in dealing then with abuse in their intimate relationship. And this is a graphic to help us just picture all of this. The broader social forces at work in the aqua-colored circle, oval. But this is particularly important for LGBTQ folks in dealing with legal issues, political issues, and so forth in various communities. The issues of discrimination, specifically in workplace, schools, and communities, and I would also include their churches and faith communities, are a part of what everybody has to deal with, and all of the isms therein. And then the overlay of relationship violence in this framework, which is our assumption related to power and control issues in relationship violence. And then in the very middle is an individual person who's struggling with all of these issues and then trying to deal with intimate partner violence in the midst of all of these issues. So in the first two webinars on our discussion, we talked more in depth about this social context, and then we saved the conversation about specific pastoral issues and individual issues for this third session. And so that's where we're going today with each of you. So in the next slide, again, to summarize, we're looking at the fundamental pastoral care goals in any situation of intimate partner violence. The three priorities are safety first for survivors and children, accountability for the abuser, restoration of individuals when possible, when appropriate of relationships. When that's not possible for a variety of reasons, then assisting people in mourning the loss of a relationship. And just a reminder to everyone that these are pretty much priority goals, that safety is the first concern, and accountability then is the next option, and then we get to restoration as a possibility. But we never start with restoration unless safety and accountability have been accomplished in some form that means that it is safe for the survivor and children. So I'd like to ask my two cohorts here to comment on the unique needs of LGBTQ survivors in the context of these goals and the role of clergy in faith settings to be able to respond. Can Jeanne, would you care to comment?
Sure. Thank you, Marie. I think one of the first difficulties in responding to survivors of intimate partner violence who are in gay, lesbian, bi relationships or transgender folks is the difficulty they have in just naming it as abuse. I think this is a problem in all intimate partner violence, but it's complicated for LGBTQ folks because we've framed the picture of the of battering, of domestic violence as a male and female problem. And so I think it's not only hard for clergy and friends and family to name it for what it is, it's also hard for the survivor to name it. And naming it is important. So we have to be able to help them and work ourselves on looking at the patterns of the behavior and not looking for our sort of stereotypical abuser and abused victim. That's one of the first things I think we encounter.
Yes. Absolutely. Joretta?
Thanks. It's good to join you all. I was thinking about, as Jeanne was talking about, the challenge for congregations or folks in different settings to create a safe enough space to talk about sexuality, much less to talk about intimate partner violence. Part of the challenge is that the church is not very good about talking about sexuality. So finding ways to create atmospheres to talk about healthy sexuality, to talk about healthy LGBT relationships, to talk about the ways in which those relationships can sometimes be destructive and distorted, just raises another issue that I think is really challenging for most folks in churches and parishes and congregations, or folks who have a clear sense of how faith impacts their life. Sexuality is not always one of those things we talk easily about. So thinking about how you get folks who are in non-dominant relationships that are heterosexual to talk about intimate partner violence is really a huge challenge, and I think it's important for us to kind of find ways, as Jeanne said, to name what's going on around us.
In some ways, I think it's like it's hard enough to come out, and then to have to come out again in terms of what's going on in your relationship is another major event.
Exactly, and we want to talk more in a minute about the context of that, whether it's safe to come out at all, and then whether it's safe, as you said, how to create safety to even acknowledge that there might be abuse in a relationship. So let's go to the next slide, please, Sarah, and kind of the fundamentals that clergy need to know in responding. The power and control dynamics in abusive relationships are the common theme. And part of the challenge in addressing LGBTQ experiences is how to understand and identify those dynamics. So the particular context is part of the challenge. And then, of course, all of the issues surrounding how we understand gender and identity and the fluidity of that as we certainly learn more and more about gender and what it means in our society. And then the crisis and trauma of violence and abuse in any relationship as a pastoral concern. And then hopefully community resources so that we'll get to that towards the end in terms of the importance of any faith leader knowing what his or her community resources are to respond to LGBT folks in the community in addressing violence. So in terms of this, of what we feel like faith leaders need to know and the issues of power and control, I want to put a case study before us to talk about for a few minutes to begin to get at some of these issues. So the situation is that Dolores is being abused by her partner, and she goes to her pastor, who is supportive and affirming of her, so she feels safe in at least speaking with that person for help with dealing with this. But she is still struggling with her belief that being a lesbian is sinful, and that is why she's being abused. In other words, the issue of believing that God is punishing her because she is a lesbian and therefore is being abused by her partner. Jeanne, how would you approach that with her?
Well, I think the first thing for the pastor to do is to say clearly that in whatever relationship, abuse is wrong. It's not an acceptable behavior in the context of any relationship. And to affirm once again for Dolores that she's a person of worth in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the church, that particular church, and that the pastor is there to guide her, support her, to advocate for her, so that she can find a way to be safe in her relationship. I do think that sometimes the tactic used by abusers in LGBTQ relationships can be using that that sense of shame that many people have from an understanding of their sexual orientation, their gender identity as being sinful. That can become a tactic used by the abuser to maintain more control. So it becomes a tool for control in the relationship. And I think the pastor can help her identify that, that that's being exploited by the abuser.
It's really using homophobia against one's partner.
Right, and then exploiting our internalized, an internalized homophobia.
Yeah, yeah. Joretta, what else would you comment on here?
Yeah, the internalized homophobia gets supported by the way in which folks interpret these sacred texts that we have. And meeting people where they are doesn't mean leaving them where they are. And so part of what I would want to do as a pastoral leader is to think about how do I preach and teach out of the sacred texts that are part of my tradition in a way that opens up resources for people rather than focusing on some of the ways that Scripture is used destructively or distortedly. And so I think part of what surrounds all of this for Dolores is how does she understand not just the texts that are important to her, but how does she understand this bigger sense that God's grace is surrounding her no matter where she is in the journey. And it strikes me that part of the challenge for churches is to embody that, is to find ways to express that kind of overwhelming compassion and care for people, even when they don't always understand something.
I think too that one of the things that she's struggling with here, a lot of victims and survivors of abuse struggle with, because they're trying to make sense out of, why would someone do this to me? And so they look to their own experience in a variety of ways for an explanation of it. It must be because I did such and such, or I am such and such. And in this case specifically, if she's focusing on, even if she's fairly comfortable with her lifestyle and choices and who she is, she still has this nagging sense that something is not right with God about this, and that must be the explanation for why her partner is abusing her. So I think that's the other place we go with her, is to reinforce with her that it's nothing about her. It's either what she does or who she is that is the source of the abuse that her partner has chosen to inflict on her. And sometimes, deconstructing that with folks in its whatever particular manifestation they're dealing with can be helpful to them, because I think all of us are always looking for some explanation and understanding when trauma happens in our lives. And sometimes we grab hold of something that really does not help us move through it and deal with it. And in this case, she's going back into her internalized homophobia to deal with that explanation. So this is an opportunity, I think, pastorally, for us to step in and help her reframe that understanding of what she's going through, so that she can then begin to decide what she wants to do about it.
Yeah, I think, Marie, the other part of that is that sometimes as we in pastoral care settings, we forget that people process the reality of God's love over time. So that Dolores may intellectually know that she's loved and cared about and that her sexual orientation is a gift from God. But in moments of really confusion, as you said, it's searching back to say, well, am I really okay? And I think those of us who are caregivers have to continue to remember that sometimes people's intellect are way ahead of their kind of reality where they live, or their soul, and helping those two things come together is really important.
I think another thing that I would add along those same lines is that one of the things that gets real confusing, particularly for, I think, religious people, Christian religious and other religious as well, is what is the meaning of love? So that's a different dynamic, which is we talk about the love of God and we talk about love being so important. And often I see people questioning, well, what does it mean to love? Shouldn't I be there for this other person who may have been a victim as well, right? And so it gets framed as, this is what it means to be committed. This is what it means to be loving and patient. And I think there's a lot of conversation we can have about what it means to be in a loving relationship, both in terms of the social support of the church, but also what does it mean to be in a loving, intimate relationship?
Yeah, which gets us back to Joretta's comments about the potential for prevention and teaching and helping guide people around healthy relationships and so forth. I think the other way that manifests for LGBTQ folks is that living in a hostile environment, basically a hostile society, that understanding of love can be distorted very easily into us against the world kind of thing, and then people get into protecting their abuser from that. So
that's a really good point.
So let's go to the next slide, please. And I want to talk a little bit about what difference it makes, what kind of faith community people are in as they struggle with these issues. And those of you who are on the webinar can think about this in terms of your experiences of faith communities and congregations. What difference does it make in an open, affirming, and supportive congregation and in a closed congregation where people may be present and active but feel the need to be closeted because of the teachings that they've heard or assumptions they make from their interaction with other congregants? So the question that comes to my mind in the midst of this is, can love the sinner, hate the sin church adequately address domestic violence for LGBTQ folks? And if so, how? And I'm really interested in each of your perspectives on that. Joretta, would you start?
Yeah, this is such a great question because defining what the sinner and the sin is becomes one of the challenging pieces, right? Part of what I am often aware of is that in communities that are less open and less affirming, folks spend so much time trying to figure out who is safe and so much energy trying to find a safe space that by the time they get there, they're so worn out from trying to figure it out that it is just, I think, damaging to the soul at that point. At the same time, I think that congregations that are in the middle of this kind of spectrum of where congregations stand, or communities of faith that are struggling with it, if they can openly and honestly, again, talk about intimate partner violence and not just talk about it in heterosexual terms, it at least opens the door for folks to say, oh, this is a place where I can talk. This is a place where I can bring a piece of myself. It certainly seems to me that it's easier in some ways in open and affirming churches to raise the questions because you're less concerned about who's going to approve or disapprove of my, quote, lifestyle, and you're more all at once available and vulnerable and open to those around you. I think the other piece about this notion of defining sin is really problematic because we tend to, when it's love the sinner, the sin is part of what gets reinforced in internalized homophobia, right? That somehow we are not just human beings and creatures who are full of goodness and love and grace, but we're sinners whose very orientation or very desires or very human relationships are called into question, and that seems to me to be a problematic starting point.
Yeah. Jeanne, what do you think?
I have the same kinds of concerns about the notion of love the sinner and hate the sin that Joretta has. I find it very difficult to think of a way to keep the sinner and the sin kind of separate. Seems to me that in the context of intimate partner violence, one of the dangers of that kind of approach would be a sense of blaming the victim for the violence, whether that's the intent of what people are trying to do or not. I think that often is the effect of that. I think to create an environment, as Joretta said, to create an environment where intimate partner violence is talked about, where it's acknowledged that it happens in all different kinds of relationships to all different kinds of people, is extremely important. But as Joretta said, the effort it takes to navigate just being in a congregation where you can't be fully who you are, on top of that, to navigate how do I talk to anybody about what's happening in my relationship when I first have to sort of present my relationship as acceptable, as worthy of being part of the community.
And defend that.
And defend it, right. You have to defend your relationship first, and then have to step back and say, but I need help with my relationship. I think the congregation can go a long way in creating an environment where abuse is not acceptable, but I think this kind of double layer makes it really hard for LGBTQ victims.
Yeah, and again, I think that overlay of the hostile environment, assumptions of homophobia and heterosexism create the need to protect, it's protecting the community, basically. So the need to say, well, our community, is already under siege from society that is hostile. Therefore, we can't talk about our problems. And other minority communities struggle with this very same issue in terms of being able to acknowledge abuse and other social problems that we experience. But I think it's particularly powerful in LGBTQ relationships, and it's probably one of the biggest things that prevents people from seeking help, because somehow we're not supposed to have these problems, and we do. So
Marie, may I add one more thing? I think that there's an added complicating factor for churches and congregations who are trying to respond to domestic violence in some way, and it's different than places that they might go for social services, which is that the couple is often the one in the congregation. It's not that you're just interacting with the victim or the abuser. The couple is sitting there, and so you've got that extra factor as well.
Yeah, as you may have for a heterosexual couple, but
Exactly.
But in any case, again, if it's a supportive congregation, then it's very people are very invested. If they're there, they're very invested in that congregation. And makes it even harder to come forward in that setting and ask for help. I'm curious what both of you think about the fact that now we have the legal right to marry. How does that affect the potential to strengthen LGBTQ relationships and the health of relationships? How might it have a negative impact in terms of the issues around domestic violence? And then what about the intersection between the legal right and the practice of each of our faith communities when it comes to marriage, and how that, again, affects the potential to provide support for same-sex couples?
This is Joretta. I think that one of the interesting conversations that we will face into the next several years is, what does it mean now to be in an intimate partnership or an intimate relationship? And marriage oftentimes becomes one of those systems that can negatively kind of keep people stuck, if you will. So there's a part of me that wonders if we can continue the conversation not about the legal right to marry, but about what does it mean to commit one's life to a partnership or a covenant relationship, and how might the church help us think about relationships that are intimate and covenanted rather than worrying about whether people are married or not, because I think marriage can sometimes get in the way of really seeing the intimate partner violence that's right in front of you.
Jeanne, do you have any comment?
Yes, I think there's a couple of added dynamics as well. One is that pressure you were talking about when in any kind of marginalized group to not want to show anything but our best side. So I've really noticed, the pressure to get married and for it to look really, really grand, and so to not talk about the difficulties, even while we don't have enough history of having strong role models for long-term committed relationships, and a lot of the social support that has historically come with marriage, right? So you don't, will take a long time to build, and I notice a lot of young couples looking for role models on how to be in a long-term relationship, how to be in a long-term gay or lesbian relationship. That's not happened yet, but the hope is of course, that there will be more and more visible role models for having those kind of relationships. I think there's also, like I said, this pressure to uphold what we've worked so hard to gain, right? And not have anybody be hold that up as saying, "See, we told you so." They should never have been married in the first place.
Yeah. And one of the things that worried me about it, because I want to be real clear that I think the legal right to marry is very, very important for the health and well-being of the community. But it's the flip side. It's a double-edged sword of pressure then to marry, and particularly in an abusive relationship where one partner is exerting power and control over the other and pushes that person into a married relationship, which is a legal contract, which then becomes potentially very complicated in terms of children and custody and property and all that goes with it. So I worry about it, and I want our faith leaders who are supporting LGBTQ relationships to just be thoughtful about that in terms of when people come to us and we are trying to do marriage prep, literally, how do we help people sort through where are they, what are their motivations, what are they looking for here, are they really at a place where this is what they both choose to do, and so forth. So I think that just an added layer on top of what is already a challenging situation facing any couple making a decision about commitment to each other.
Yeah.
So let's go to the next slide. So the particular issues of forgiveness and accountability, and I want to talk about how that fits in, again, specifically for LGBTQ folks. But let me begin with another quick case study just to give us some real-life people to bounce off of here. Philip's abuse of Michael has become more public in church settings, again, in an affirming setting where the couple is out and the congregation is supportive. But Philip, in that public setting, is belittling Michael, teasing him about being an ex-Catholic, and won't allow him to participate in certain church activities. So he's limiting his choice as to his own activities and agency. And you as a faith leader observe this. So this is not a situation where Michael is coming to you, but in fact you're observing this behavior on Philip's part. How would you respond? Jeanne, would you start?
I think there's a couple of things come to mind as I imagine this scenario. And once again, I'm thinking about how do we create an environment where these kind of behaviors are not acceptable. And how do we do that in a way where everyone feels that they are a part of a community of faith, of a loving church. So how do we do it in terms of holding someone accountable without them feeling damned in a kind of way? So I think it's very important that we find ways to lovingly and yet clearly communicate that certain behaviors are not acceptable when we see them. I would suggest that we create a kind of community where someone would say to Philip, "Hey, that's not all right. Don't talk to Michael that way." I mean, that's a beginning. Just name the behaviors and say, that's not the way to behave to your partner. And then to create space where this is talked about in a more general way, so that Michael could feel that he would have, that he would be cared for, supported, and listened to if he was to go to someone in the congregation, to one of the leaders or to the pastor. Or that Philip would be able to do the same and say, you know, I don't like the way things are going in my relationship. I don't like the way I'm acting. Where can I get some help with this?
Yeah, Jeanne, I really like the way you're broadening the accountability not just to the pastoral leader but to the community that surrounds. That if we call one another on our behaviors in general when we're not being appropriate, it helps us to have a stronger communication system all the way around the table, I would think. And I really like that kind of thinking about how do we help people say out loud, this is not acceptable. We will not tolerate kind of folks being treated this way. I think the other piece you're lifting up really nicely is a way in which people can find their voice when they're asked to be accountable. But hopefully the accountability is not put upon them as a guilt trip, but as a way of saying, how would you like to be in this relationship, and how might we help you move toward that, whether it's Philip or Michael, either one coming to talk to someone.
And let me push a little further in terms of concrete response to this, again, this public experience within a congregation. As pastor or lay leader or friend, concerned friend. I mean, this is the other place where I think we have roles with each other. How could we, whom should we speak to here, and how, and in what setting? I mean, I'm sort of leaning towards, you know, trying to speak to Michael separately and trying to speak to Philip separately to begin a conversation of exactly the issues you all have raised in terms of, well, you know, what's going on here. So what is y'all's thinking about how to go about it?
I think you have to be,
good.
I think you have to be a little bit careful, and I think some of it depends on the relationship you have. There's the impulse for the, say, the pastor or someone else. I think it might be easier for someone who's not the pastor, but for someone to speak to Michael in where Michael has some privacy. But even just noticing whether or not Michael ever gets privacy in a way that you might talk to them individually is another way of assessing how much control, how much coercion is going on in this relationship. One of the things we don't know is what's happening when they're not in public, if this is happening when they are in public. So to maintain Michael's safety and to be aware of that, and if you approach Michael and know that Philip, the abuser, might be watching Michael, you have to be very careful if you think there's this heightened, if it's a highly controlling relationship, then you can put Michael at some risk.
Yeah, right. And the other caution there for our listeners, just to remind that it would not be helpful to invite Michael and Philip to come in to talk to you as a pastor. The couples setting is not only not helpful, but is dangerous to a victim or survivor of abuse in the very ways that you're describing, I think, Jane, very well. So just a reminder that in this situation, and this could happen also in a heterosexual situation, what we might observe publicly, that we need to be very careful how we engage either or both of the individuals in beginning to raise some questions about, you know, what's going on here and how can we be helpful. So let's talk more the pieces of accountability and forgiveness. And Joretta, I know that, you've certainly worked on this. We've worked on this together over the years. But what comments would you make in this context specifically about that?
Yeah, I think I really appreciate what you both have said about this case and the need to walk with care. One of the things I would listen for, not necessarily interpret out loud, but listen for, are the easy apologies, and try to get a sense of what it is people think they're apologizing for in order to think about what might be the next step in terms of not necessarily doing forgiveness, but helping people discern when when apologies are ringing true in a different way. For example, it would be easy for Philip to say, well, I tell Michael I'm sorry, or to apologize publicly in the middle of noticing something, and helping both of them in very different ways think about what is an apology. Is it just I'm sorry, or is there a change of behavior? I think, Marie, as you've talked about it, the repentance, if you will, a way in which people turn around and say, oh, I need to not do that because it's diminishing to someone else. And getting to that step is really challenging and difficult, I think.
Yeah, it's not cheap grace. It's not quick and easy. But the apology part, I think you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, the apology can become the cover,
Right.
and the behavior basically continues. But particularly in a public setting, an apology smooths it over, heals the wound lightly, as they say in Jeremiah, and doesn't help either of them really deal with what's going on here.
And it reinforces the homophobia in some ways.
Say more about that.
Well, it reinforces a tool that particularly people of faith have come to see as important, this notion of forgiveness or apology, and to use it lightly or to use it as a cover for ongoing abuse, for example, reinforces this kind of sense of, well, they said they were sorry, so there must be something wrong with me because I can't forgive. And that kind of distortion of what forgiveness is, I think, is one of the things that we have to keep talking about in the realm of intimate partner violence in general.
And it may come very much later in the process. Yeah. Jeanne?
I think this reminds me of something we haven't really said, which is that the places that LGBTQ abusers can go to get help, to change those behaviors, is extremely limited.
Yeah.
And it's not something that pastors can do. Pastors, I think, should be committed to walking alongside and encouraging and supporting abusers who want to change their behavior. But the services are just not out there for the most part. And it's not been particularly successful when certain programs have tried to put gay or lesbian or trans abusers in batterers treatments groups with straight men. And so I don't have an answer for that. I'm just naming the difficulty of that. The best hope is going through the anti-violence projects, but many smaller cities and certainly small towns don't have access to those programs as well. So that's an added issue for this topic.
Yeah, and the limitations within the community to provide for that. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about resources, and then we'll see if we have questions to address. Next slide. Just a reminder of the first two sessions of this discussion that we've already had at Faith Trust, and we invite those of you who might have missed those to go back and pick those up. And then the next slide. These are some of the resources that are available and either online or with hotline availability nationally. that we certainly strongly recommend people being aware of and utilizing. In regard to, Jeanne, your point of the limited local resources that we have, but definitely look around in your community and see if, in terms, talk to the existing domestic violence programs and ask them, do they have any provision for LGBTQ folks? Are there any special groups that they've started, or what would they do if someone came to a shelter, for example? Because that's the other issue, is where to find safe shelter if you really do have to get out of a dangerous situation. So I think from the pastor's perspective, what I want to encourage is find that out ahead of time so that you have a sense of what your options are, even if they're limited, and then how far you would have to go to help them find a resource, literally, for safety issues. And then on the next slide, the publications that are out there, these are some of the things that we would certainly recommend. But thankfully, there is more and more now being written and provided for all of us in terms of these issues. So we are, I think, at a very important point in the development of resources within the community to name and to respond to intimate partner violence. So let's see if we have any particular questions or concerns from our colleagues here before we conclude. Sarah?
Yeah, I do have a question here. One of the issues that you mentioned on the previous slide was what faith leaders need to know. And there was an issue of crisis intervention or knowledge of how to deal with a crisis situation. And the question is, does the stress of a hostile environment contribute to the stress of abuse for victims? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Anybody?
It's a great.
I'm sorry, Sarah. This is Jeanne, and I missed the last part of that question.
The question was whether the stress of a hostile environment, culturally or within a congregation, if that contributes to the stress of the abuse to the victim.
It's such a nice comment, Terry, on the challenge for folks who are in marginalized positions, whether it's out of issues of orientation or gender identity or race or class, that the environment around us is not safe, and so therefore it adds a kind of layer of stress and anxiety that I think we oftentimes don't really recognize in ourselves. So that I think it definitely contributes to the way in which the stress and anxiety of even talking about intimate partner violence or about one's experience with a person that you love is just really traumatizing almost.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of it's sort of course it's a factor, as Joretta is saying, in terms of many marginalized groups' experience, but it's the particularity in which it limits people's resources and ability to name what's going on and so forth that we've been talking about. And I think for those of us in faith communities, we've got to acknowledge and take some responsibility for the ways we contribute to that, the stress, the anxiety, the hostility that we are a part of in people's lives, so that I think we have an extra special responsibility to go the extra mile to try to create safe space, explicit safe space, which is why I think it's so challenging, back to our question of, where is your faith community on these issues? I think it's so challenging to be in that sort of in-between space of, well, we don't really support your relationship, but we want to support you because we know that you're suffering. I think that's really hard to do. because it's a contradiction, and it only feeds the larger experience of the hostility of the larger culture. So I want to highlight that as part of what I think is incumbent on us as faith leaders to really get our act together on these issues and be explicitly supportive of folks' relationships and whatever it is they're going through, and whatever the nature of their relationship and their family, when they need help, that we can be there for them. Is there anything else?
Yeah, one more question, and it's about, let's see, let me try to frame this. Many LGBTQ couples may be separated or isolated from their family of origin and living within a small community. So the question is about the impact of isolation and perhaps a heightened isolation within that situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think that that's a big issue for LGBTQ couples and who are experiencing intimate partner violence, because one of the fears is I will lose all my friends, and it's so hard to find this group of friends in the first place. And it's often a very tight-knit, small group of friends, where the fear of being isolated from the only social support you have is a big reason to stay in a relationship, and it also can be used once again as a tactic of the abuser to say, if you leave me, you won't have any friends at all.
Yeah, and you already don't have any family, so
right.
You don't have anybody. Yeah, I think it exacerbates that situation enormously. And again, I'll come back to the church's responsibility to create alternative contexts of support, so that people know that even if their families have abandoned them and don't want to be a part of their lives anymore, there is somewhere else where there's a community of people and that cares and is going to be there for them. And I think, again, for the LGBTQ community, being small and being in most areas small and dealing with the internal dynamics and politics and whatever that goes on, that to remind people that the importance of having people outside the community that we can go to. So that's where, again, I think the church is so important, to be a place where there are multiple folks and multiple resources and options for people to reach out for help when they need it. Because for some people, the same thing is true in terms of ethnic communities. Some people choose to step outside the community to deal with the abuse that might be happening to them because of their fears about what goes on in the community. And I think LGBTQ folks have that same experience. So how do we broaden those resources? And that's why it's also important for our advocacy colleagues to make sure that the resources available in the wider community are safe resources for anyone, regardless of who they are and what they're bringing to that experience. Any other thoughts on that from either of you? Or conclusions?
Yeah, I do think that those who are caregivers, care providers, mental health providers in small rural areas face a similar kind of isolation, that finding colleagues across the internet is just as important in some ways, because it is isolating.
Yeah, and being able to reach out for consultation with colleagues who share some of the same concerns and values. Jeanne, any closing comments?
Oh, I thought you said that very well.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you all very much for being with us. We will conclude now. And again, the first two sessions of this discussion that we've already had, feel free to access. Feel free to pass along to your colleagues, and we hope it's been helpful to you. And let me turn it back to Sarah, who will tell you how this whole thing ends up.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. That was a great conversation. You're going to be closing up the webinar window in a moment, and if you will just take a moment and fill out our short survey, we would be very grateful. Give us your feedback about this webinar, ideas or suggestions for future webinars. We've gotten some great ideas from our audience members. You can view all of our upcoming webinars online at faithtrustinstitute.org. And this concludes today's presentation. Thank you so much, Jeanne and Joretta and Marie, and I'll email the presentation slides to the audience members this afternoon. So thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.